Welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Chapter 14, Surrealism. This is an exciting one to talk about, an interesting art movement in the 1920s and 30s. Surrealism is interesting because it grows out of Dadaism. So here are the questions for today, and we will talk about the roots of surrealism. Surrealism is an art movement that focuses on the subconscious or the collective unconscious and the ideas of Freud. It's actually based on earlier and actually gets formed by earlier Dada artists. So some of the first practitioners are actually writers like Andre Breton. Breton had been interested and had mentioned that his own writing was surrealist, as did Apollinaire, the poet, described his writings as well as the Parade ballet that we had talked about that Picasso helped to design some of the costumes and the set for that. He married the dancer Olga that he met there. Those were all labeled as surrealist. And then Breton starts to move, getting bored with Dadaism, gets interested in more of a pure surrealism. And so it really codifies around Andre Breton and some of the early Zurich Dada artists like Jean Arp, also known as Hans Arp, and others, which we'll get into. But it comes out of this kind of parlor game trick called automatic writing. And also, so just kind of stream of consciousness, whatever comes to mind, indebted to the writings of Gertrude Stein, the poet, the earlier 19th century poet, Arthur Rimbaud, Rimbaud. So it started first as kind of a field of writing and surrealism, surrealist thought. But this parlor game idea of automatic writing, where you would write a few words, fold it up, and the person would only know one of the words and would continue the sentence. And then you opened it up and it said a new phrase or a new sort of story, a short sentence. You'd write part of a sentence, I'd fold it up, you'd only see a word or two, and then the next person would write, and on and on. It's a fun game. You should play it if you've never done it. And one such game produced this line: the exquisite corpse will drink the young wine. So maybe someone saw the word drink and they added the young wine to it, for instance. Okay, so this phrase, the exquisite corpse, started a new game that Andre Breton and others like Tristan Tzara, who was part of Zurich Dada, started to play, where they would just draw one shape, maybe a head, and then someone else would draw the torso, the body, the leg, and could fold it up in such a way that maybe they saw the head. This is a fun game to play as well. Fold up a piece of paper into 4 sections. Someone draws the head, and then the next person just sees where the head ends, but they don't know what the head looks like. They draw the shoulders, the next person draws the torso and the arms, the next person draws the legs and the feet, and it creates this new fantastical arrangement of ideas. And somewhere in there is proof of evidence. It's kind of what everyone was thinking about the collective unconscious. I tend to think of it like, it seems like sometimes there is a general zeitgeist or spirit or a phenomenon of things that are popular, right? Like for instance, all of a sudden sloths became really, really popular. For a minute it was armadillos, honey badger, whatever it is, like it's, and then you start to see it everywhere and it really, really spreads in popular society. Same kind of idea with surrealism, that there's maybe something that we can tap into in our dreams and our waking state, on collective unconscious, that there's something bigger out there, right? And Andre Breton started writing about these ideas in this concept, the prospect of the possibilities of automatic writing in his 1922 surrealist text called The Magnetic Field, which is pretty cool because there is a modern rock group that got their band name from his writings, The Magnetic Fields. But kind of putting unusual juxtapositions next to one another. That's sort of the foundations of surrealism. Now, if we were in class together in person, we would actually play Exquisite Corpse. I like to do it. Fold up a sheet of paper into four. One person draws the head, the next person draws the body, and pass it around. But you don't see what the person before you drew. You only see where the lines end. So I encourage y'all to play it. It's a pretty cool game. It's fun. And from its beginning, there were kind of some early association and exhibition of surrealist artists. It included this artist, Jean Arp, who we'll talk about, Hans Arp, Giorgio de Chirico, who we talked about before, the Italian artist who was into metaphysical art. Max Ernst, who we talked about before, was a Dada artist. Paul Klee, who taught at the Bauhaus, who we just talked about. Man Ray, who was a New York Dada artist that had done those rayograms and also the iron with the tacks on it, the piece called Gift. Miro and Picasso exhibited together. Shortly after that, they were joined by Marcel Duchamp and Picabia, who were the two that started New York Dada. And then later, Rene Magritte and Salvador Dali, who ironically become the two most famous, most associated practitioners of surrealism. They joined later. They didn't join until 1929, when this first exhibition was in 1925. Jean Arp did a lot of pieces. Oh, and by the way, there was two kind of main splits, two different directions that surrealism took. The abstract, like Jean Arp and Jean Moreau, and then the more metaphysical branch of realism endowed with some surrealistic aspects like Magritte and Salvador Dali. So kind of think of those two separate branches, but coming off the main concept or connection, right? So this was a group of artists that started to collaborate, write together, do this automatic writing, and show their work together. It became wildly popular, on par with like Impressionism at the end of the 19th century. Bigger and better than Cubism, it spread throughout. So it was very, very influential and inspired a lot of people to become artists as well. So there was this sort of natural progression or transformation from Dada, which was seen as kind of anti-art, into those same artists, and then with the addition of some other artists, it becomes surrealism. And Hans Arp has this very famous quote where he said, "Art is a fruit that grows in man, like a fruit on a plant or a child in its mother's womb." And so this influenced his next group of works, which were very biomorphic, really organic shapes. And he was inspired by some of the works that we saw at the end of Dada, which were like kind of random. Like he created those works where he tore up things and just let them drop, like Marcel Duchamp, and he experimented with chance. We could see that as well, but he was pushing it one step further. This piece here called Head, with three annoying objects, he saw his artwork as being more concrete than abstract, because abstract means to basically take away from something else. And he was seeing this art as already existing in its own right and being somewhat realistic of an idea as opposed to an abstraction from something real. So concretion, as he said, signifies the natural process of condensation, hardening, coagulating, thickening, growing together. And he talked about it being solid, like a mass, like an animal, like man. So in this case, it's not a head, but he calls it a head. So it has that kind of portrait or personification quality to it. And these three annoying objects on the actual head here have been given names. He identified them. This one here is a mustache. This one here is a mandolin. And this one here is a fly. And what's cool about them is they weren't actually fixed to the object itself. So this was bronze. He had an earlier version of this that was made in plaster. And they weren't fixed on there, so you could move them around. And he wanted the viewer, who came into a gallery to rearrange them, but also the person who bought it, the collector, to be able to rearrange it. So it makes art more interactive, less static, and also kind of given over to chance as well. So you can see this kind of biomorphic versus not necessarily rectilinear art. The next artist that started as a Dada artist is Max Ernst. He served in the German army in World War I. His work was very anti-war. He's really interesting because he has a diverse body of work. He was inspired by Freud because he said the artist didn't really come up with the work. The work was already there. And in some cases, he in other words said he didn't title his artwork. His artwork came into existence and the title was already there. He could think of the title first, then make the piece, and whatever happened, it then relates to that title that he made. Or what he could do is he could make the piece and someone else sees something in it, and that would encourage the title. So similar to Freud, thinking about ideas of psychoanalysis, right? So if there is something innate in humans that makes them dangerous or have a propensity to violence, like we can see in this particular image, psychoanalysis, Freud posited as a theory that we could find that underlying reason why they are gravitating towards violence, and we could cure that in that particular person, right? And also the idea of fetishism from Freud, that there are some things in our art or some things in our lives that we're inspiring, that we are relating to or inspired by because of the sensory experience of those objects, which we can really see in Max Ernst's works. For instance, these with the textures, or kind of reading into the image, or this with the textures, which we'll get more into. But also that there's this sort of story that's being told and everybody's going to see something different. And Freud, through psychoanalysis, could say that that means something about us. And you could see why this idea of being able to treat the person and maybe cure their violent urges would be particularly relevant at this time, coming out of World War I, having served in the army and worried about the threat of another rise of a potential dictatorship, and eventually later responding to Nazism and the rise of Hitler in Germany after that. So this idea of what happens to us as a child influences who we become as an adult. And we see that in this work. So it's called Two Children Are Threatened by a Nightingale. And he says this, and he writes it from third person, which I think is interesting. It's an artist statement, but it's in third person. He says, he never imposes a title on a painting. He, meaning Max Ernst, he waits until a title imposes itself. Here, however, the title existed before the picture was even painted. A few days before, he had written a prose poem which began with the phrase, "A night falls at the edge of town. Two children are threatened by a nightingale." He did not attempt to illustrate this poem, but this is the way that it happened, which is really interesting because it kind of talks about automatic writing, or this kind of collective unconscious of just like subconscious, of just like what comes to the surface, these other ideas that are maybe just below our waking consciousness, right? So in it, there are two-dimensional elements and there are three-dimensional elements, including the frame. This is interesting because it's 2D and 3D, and Max Ernst breaks the traditional 2D plane by making the work jut out in front of the frame, right? It has this fence that's been applied to it here. So this gate that's swung open, this button here, which reads like a doorbell almost, or perhaps a handle to a gate. And we can see the two children who are being threatened by a nightingale. Here's one child that seems dreamlike, like Freud. She's carrying a knife and she's running away. And here we see another child who fell on the ground. And this is the nightingale that they're threatened by. But probably more of an ominous threat that we're aware of that maybe they don't know about is this gentleman here holding another young girl and kind of escaping the scene, literally escaping the painting, reaching out for this three-dimensional doorknob right here. Really interesting juxtaposition, and it answers more questions. It asks more questions than it necessarily answers, right? It poses more questions when you look at it. He developed two techniques that were really, really interesting that kind of relate to exquisite corpse. The first is called frottage, and that just literally means rubbing. So what he would do, just like a child would do, he would take thin paper and put it over textural items and do rubbings and kind of see what happened. And then he manipulated them a little bit in like a Duchampian manner and found these forms kind of emerging. Like this one kind of looked like a figure, so he cut it out and placed it on a background. And he was inspired by these different forms that he would see. I'm sure you've played this game before where you look at the stain on a wall and maybe a form emerges, or you're looking at the texture in the floor, in the wood grain, and all of a sudden you see an image emerge, right? And you look back and you can't find that same image. It's different every single time. And if we think about what Freud would say, whether we believe it's true or not, that there would be something latent in us that makes us see that particular thing, right? He also created another technique called grittage, which means scraping, which he would put thin layers of paint on the canvas, put a sheet of paper over top of it, and press a texture along it to create this dragging, weird, kind of spreading, articulated texture. And this is called Europe After the Rain in the 1940s, and it was meant to look like the war-ravaged European landscape after World War I. And also World War II. In 1941, Ernst fled World War II in Europe and settled in New York City. Just like we learned in the last chapter, a lot of these artists whose works were labeled degenerate had to leave Nazi Germany. Really interesting artist, and his work influences a lot of the other artists around him as well. This is sort of foundational abstraction and realistic representation, kind of merging the two. Jean Miro was a Spanish artist similar to Picasso. He also worked in Paris similar to Picasso, but he kept going back to his native country of Spain. He liked his Catalan roots. They, consistently inspired his work. And he did a series of paintings that were based on harlequins, just like Picasso did, and circus performers. But they're very imaginative. They look like kind of what's happening on a microscopic level as opposed to real level. And just really creative and imaginative. At first, if you look at this, it looks abstract, but then you can see that these shapes actually take on proxies or anthropomorphic kind of figures, cartoony figures of people, cats, performers, acrobats, people here on the ladder, and the window here, just a musician here in the center. Really imaginative works. A variety of shapes, kind of imagining an unreal world. He also translated this to collage, and what he would do is similar to Hans Arp. He would rip apart newspapers and then create collages from them and do a painting based on the new drawing or the new collage that resulted. So this is an example. This is called painting, and it's based on one of those collages that he made, torn from a newspaper to kind of make a sketch that then he would then base an image on. And now it kind of seems like automatic writing because it's just these biomorphic, amorphous shapes that don't really mean or look like anything. But what we do as a viewer, and there's kind of this psychoanalysis part of it influenced by Freud, maybe Miro didn't even intend it, but maybe we start to see things in the image. For instance, I see a figure right here with their arms up, and this is a head. Do you see anything in its composition? Do you see anything that looks like a person or a man or an animal? A lot of people look at this form right here and see a cat or a dog, right? Like this is the face, here's the ear, here's the tail, and these are inadvertent, but we see them, right? And there's this kind of universal way that we generally read into things, right? That's human nature, to seek closure, to make real out of the unreal. With the outbreak of World War II, Miro had to flee from his home in Normandy, and then go back to Spain, but that was occupied by Franco. And so he started to shift his work. His later work is beautiful. So while fleeing from the Nazis in France to go back to occupied Spain, he made these beautiful works called constellations, and he has a series of about 25 of these that are watercolors, really, really small. So that's an interesting thing about surrealism too. Oftentimes the scale is unexpected. They're much smaller than what we've seen in other works. They're not monumental, but that also has a reality of the war going on and materials are scarce, right? Paper and metal and all those sort of things are being used for the war effort. So here we see, this is called The Poetess from the Constellations series. Some of his most evocative and beautiful and abstract work. Sorry for the phone. And when you look, there are very intentional hidden images like this mustached face here, or this figure over here that looks almost like a bird, or here an eye, a mustache. Surrealistic, not quite abstract, because there's sort of a realness to this unreality or surreality. So this is abstract, and I think it really relates to his strife as an individual artist and having to deal with the realism of post-World War I and World War II going on around him. Another thing to think about in terms of these artists is that each of them, there isn't a set kind of style, although we can see some similarities. Like when I look at the work of Yves Tanguy, I see kind of a little bit the prefiguration of what's going to happen with Salvador Dali. But there's not a necessarily consistent set of everybody doing kind of the same style. Look at how different these works are. And that's because it goes back to the ideal of during Romanticism of the unique individual. Remember, Paul Klee was pushing for that too during the Bauhaus. Every artist is unique. Instead of having to teach someone how to become an artist, there's already an artist in them, which goes to show you that a person like Yves Tanguy, who was self-taught, didn't even need to go to art school to learn how to be an artist because he already had great art ideas. These were surrealistic landscapes, very, very beautiful pieces, interesting, pretty famous surrealist, but I think it's unfortunate. I think his wife gets second billing and she should actually get first billing. So Kay Sage was an American surrealist. She was married to the French-born self-taught artist Yves Tanguy, and her work is beautiful, really, really interesting. These invented landscapes, which, Yves Tanguy did these as well. Deep space, really, really deep space in kind of a curious space. Like, could this really exist? Is this a desert landscape? Is this a landscape that's being formed or being destroyed? Really, really curious. And we see that in Kay Sage's work as well. She also is recognized for a lot of times these invented architecture. She is really this kind of golden age of surrealism, but what the hell? She's not even in the book at all. And if you go to the MoMA, they have amazing paintings like this of Kay Sage. So, I think it's unfortunate that sometimes when we include artists in the canon, we exclude other artists. And if we look, the artists are there. And Kay Sage exhibited with the Surrealists. She had a good reputation. Her work was very, very mature and fit the bill of surrealism. These are her work. She has tons of masterpieces, but she's enigmatic, right? As a person, she gets left out of the story, and I think it's a really, really interesting case of who gets to decide what's in the canon and what's left out, what's in the museums, or what pieces are important. I think part of it could be unintentional, right? But part of it could be sexist and how many women have been left out. Tanguy assaulted Kay Sage verbally and sometimes physically, pushing her and sometimes even physically threatening her with a knife Um, he also butted heads physically and verbally with other artists. And however contentious or abusive their relationship was, Kay Sage was still devastated by Tangai's death. And she died herself not long afterwards. You know, it's a really tragic story. This is how she died. Kay Sage wrote in a journal in August 1961, "I have said all that I have to say. There is nothing left for me to do but scream." And then she killed herself, shooting herself through her heart. Uh, and she wanted to be cremated, and she asked for her ashes and Eve Tangai's ashes to be spread in the same spot. Really, really interesting story, dedicated to surrealism. Unfortunately, we don't always talk about Kay Sage's work. I love it. It's brilliant. Do yourself a favor. Seek out more of Kay Sage's work. See it in person. It's really, really impressive. It's also on a smaller scale, so is Yves Tangai's work. And then also do a Google search. Check out Kay Sage's work. Really, really beautiful. Probably the preeminent, most famous and innovative artist, mostly associated, probably the biggest name that we associate with surrealism is Salvador Dali. Just like Picasso, he is from Spain. Just like Jean Moreau, he is from the Catalan region of Spain. And he is interested in ideas of Freud, dreams, dreamscapes, landscapes that are unreal, similar to Yves Tanguy, similar to Kay Sage. We can see these ideas and a contrast, often a contrast between things that are hard and things that are soft. And he described his work as a paranoid critical. In other words, this paranoid vision of not being able to trust other people. And this work is really, really small. I don't think most people would understand that when they think of it. Usually it's reproduced as like posters and large, and it's tiny. It's like this big, y'all. It's like this big, 9 by 13 inches, teeny tiny. He mastered this art of making things, even though they were not realistic, unreal, invented. He made them real. He made them realistic, so we could benefit from what was in his mind, which was bizarro and next level. Am I right? Just like on an entirely different level. He would make them real. He would manifest them so they became physically real. We could see what was going on in his head. Where does this idea of these soft things come from? See this melting clock, this very stereotypical Salvador Dali thing, and this is called the persistence of memory, right? This idea of time. He had a group of friends over. Some of his fellow Dada and Surrealist artists were over his house. They were drinking wine, they were eating cheese, and towards the end of the night, he noticed that the cheese was so soft that it started to conform to the shape of the plate and the table. He immediately asked everybody to leave, and he started to paint in on these melting clock images because he saw this camembert cheese and said, "This is what my art is." The reality of that thing that is pushing past space and time, that paranoid critical, something that is both there and not there at the same time. We see this oyster fish-like shape that has a nose, an eyebrow, but no eye, or maybe the eye is closed, this eyelash here. This is possible set a series of objects, right? A series of ants, a horde, an army of ants on this clock, which we saw in another work as well. His piece on page 310, Accommodations of Desire, that has an egg covered in ants. He was also interested in film. He collaborated with Disney. It never was released, but he did release a film called Un Chien Andalou, which has a very famous gross scene of a person being held down and their eyeball cut. It was a fake eye, but still very, very grotesque. If you study film, if you ever watch, experimental films, it's a classic. And he also has in that some grotesque imagery of a hand being covered in ants. And some of these things had real associations, and some of them had symbolic associations or associations that he, things that were French, things that were Spanish, right? But things also that he just wanted you personally to read into them, and whatever you saw was true. Salvador Dali was very eccentric. He became, like Picasso, a larger-than-life figure, very epic. People started to film him. He had the very famous mustache that went up, really, really huge. Towards the end of his career, he knew he was going to die. He started randomly signing blank canvases and told people, you make the Salvador Dali, which has made it very difficult to prove that all the Salvador Dalis are Salvador Dalis, because some have been forged and have his actual autograph on them. Really, really interesting figure that was very outgoing, right? This piece too, as we mentioned, think about Guernica, 1937 by Picasso. They're from the same region. This piece is inspired also by war and the threat of war during the Spanish Civil War. This is called soft construction with boiled beans. What? Premonitions of a civil war. And this is talking about the surrealist imagery, which wasn't intended to be politically innate. It had political aspirations. A lot of these artists were socialists or communists, or seeing what was happening in Russia and becoming Soviet communism. They favored Trotsky. For instance, the artist Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo put up Trotsky. They liked the kind of pure version of communism before it was destroyed, distorted, and turned into a revolution in Russia. So some of these artists also, like Andre Breton, were anarchists. They saw what was happening after World War I, predating World War II, and they didn't like the new political structures. And if capitalism didn't work, and if dictatorships didn't work, then what next, right? So these things were not meant to be unbiased or apolitical. They were very, very political in their day. That's why an artist like Salvador Dali had to leave Spain, leave France, and lived for a while in the United States, where he painted weird society portraits, but also things that were critical of the war, because he wouldn't have been able to do that in his own homeland. That's why a painting like this exists in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. Remember, Picasso's painting of Guernica existed in New York until Franco was taken out of power, and then boom, it was returned to Madrid. So just like Gaudí, Jean Miro, and Picasso, Salvador Dali is inspired by Spain and the reality, the social and political reality of his day. Another really important artist that couldn't be any different than Salvador Dali is René Magritte. René Magritte is one of my favorite artists. I really like. He's definitely my favorite surrealist artist, one of my favorite artists in general as well. He was a Belgian artist. He was more of an outsider. He dropped out of art school and then was inspired by works like Paul Klee and others, Marc Chagall, and he started to make work that was symbolist. And for instance, this piece, but he was really quiet. He was low-key. He was an outsider. He kept to himself, which means that he wasn't as wildly popular in his own lifetime like Salvador Dali was. He had a bit of exposure, but ironically, he was more interested in kind of keeping to himself, where a lot of these surrealist artists were very, very social and out there with their imagery. Just like Dali's, the artwork was saying something, but Dali was also saying something, writing about his work, and Magritte was just letting his work speak for itself. One of the things that he was really interested in is semiotics. Semiotics is the study of linguistics and kind of the cultural and philosophical investigation into what language means, what words can mean, right? So there's this idea that there's the sign, and then there is the signifier, and then there is the signified. So in the case of this painting, the sign would be the painter, would be the painting itself, right? The signifier would be this pipe. But as Magritte says, this is not a pipe. This is the treachery or perfidy of images. Perfidy of images meaning the betrayal or denial of images. And then the signified is the actual pipe that you can hold in your hands. But all three of those things, the sign, the signifier, and the signified, are all different, right? And they're all open to interpretation and our individual perspective on them. So this is a very famous piece. It has this French saying at the bottom, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe," which means this is not a pipe, right? Which doesn't make sense because it is a pipe. But no, in reality, it's a painting of a pipe. So it's symbolism. It's not signified, right? It's the signifier, or in this case, it's basically a painting of the thing itself, which is interesting. It's a take on illusion, and it's also a take on a play on words, right? I also love this piece here where it's kind of the same idea. It's not really the landscape. It's the painting of a landscape, but it's even a painting of the painting of the landscape. Does that make sense, right? This isn't really a landscape back here. It's the painting of a landscape. And this too is the painting of a landscape that kind of merges to create this illusion and reminding you, based just like semiotics, if I say yellow taxi cab, then you are all thinking about a yellow taxi cab, but all of our experiences are different. Perhaps you're thinking about the last time you were actually in a taxi. Maybe you've never been in one, so you're thinking about a movie, or even just thinking about a pipe. I've never smoked a pipe, but I know what one smells like. And I associate a pipe with my friend Lowell, or maybe someone else associates a pipe with their grandfather, right? So there's memory. And there's a slippage of in between the sort of translation of these images, which are really experiences. So Magritte is really forcing us to think. Another thing that's really interesting about the work of the surrealists is they're very misogynistic. Dali talked about sexual violence quite a bit in his work, that his works were a depiction of sexual violence. Picasso talked about the relationship between sex and disease. And in René Magritte's work, here we see this idea of Freudian sexual anxiety, reading into something, and fetishism and sexual urges, right? And also this idea of the femme fatale, which means that women can be bad and dangerous. There's this character that women are, just like Eve, threatening men, that they're tempting men and could lure them in and then murder them or kill them or change them, right? And so we see some of this idea of sexual violence. And I think this piece is really, really interesting because it's both the face of a female, but it's also the body of a female, and there's really no personification of a person. It's just reduced them to their sexual organs, right? The breasts, pubic hair here, but this is a neck, and this is also a face. So you could read it as eyes, a nose, and a mouth. This inspired Monty Python, if anyone's seen Monty Python, and the illustrations at the beginning, the collage-like illustrations, very much indebted to Magritte and Salvador Dali. So we see the uncanny, we see this idea of sexual violence and the propensity of women as danger in the works, which is really, really ironic because considering there were a lot of very important female players as part of surrealism that were included and other times excluded, just like Kay Sage was married to Eve Tanguy, exhibited with them, but never got the credit that a lot of the other artists did, as well as this female artist, Merritt Oppenheim, whose work is really, really interesting. I think it's worth digging in deeper, or if you're thinking about doing your formal analysis or even want to write more or historical about a particular artist, Merritt Oppenheim is one that's very, very interesting. She did a lot of jewelry that she made of fur-lined metal. She was drinking tea with Pablo Picasso, and he quipped, you know, you could damn near cover anything with fur. And she said, even this cup and saucer, which she then did. And this is called Object Le Déjeuner en Fourrure, which means luncheon in fur. And this kind of sensory, uncanny, unrealistic, but also at the same time hyper realistic, surreal, because it is actually a silver spoon and a saucer covered in real fur, in a Chinese gazelle's fur. This fur-lined teacup has become really the archetype of surrealist objects. So in other words, it's sort of like the Duchampian take something, rectify it a little bit, and now it's something entirely different. We couldn't imagine drinking, putting sugar in this tea and drinking out of it. It's something entirely different. It's both attractive, it's beautiful, and repellent at the same time. It looks great, but I bet it wouldn't be great to drink out of it. So it creates desire and dread at the same time. Really, really beautiful and thought-provoking. I think this also lends itself to what we see later, not just in surrealism, but in cinema and advertising in the United States, right? Thinking about things that happened later with symbolism. The next artist that I want to talk about is very, very interesting as well. And some of the discussions that we're having today about gender, about pronouns, about gender identity, have been with us longer than you can imagine. It sounds like a recent discussion, but this is a very interesting artist. This is a female artist, Lucy Renee Matilda Schwab, who went by the name of, so she was born female, but she adopted a gender-neutral name, Claude Cahoon, and made work that denied her femininity. She intentionally took photographs that were masculine. And now I don't know her preferred pronouns. We always describe her as feminine, becoming more gender neutral. I bet if she was alive today, could perhaps prefer a pronoun of he, him, or they, them. Who knows for sure? But decided to live a gender neutral life, was a lesbian, and was very out about that, right? Which would have been very, very controversial at its time. And now remember, Hitler not only imprisoned and put into concentration camps Jews, but also gypsies, people that were living bohemian lifestyles and extravagant gay lifestyles. So gay and lesbian people also. She had been arrested. Nazis repeatedly sacked her home and her studio, stole her work, destroyed most of the work she created. So we're fortunate to still have some of the pieces. Luckily, with photography, you could make multiples. So maybe she had already sold some of the pieces, or they sold some of the pieces. But they also put into pockets of German soldiers transparent messages on tissue paper that once you held them in a certain light, you could see that they were anti-war propaganda. This was so dangerous. They had to flee for their life. They were lucky that in 1944 is when they are arrested and condemned to death. But the liberation at the end of the sentence saved them and their partner from death. If that had happened a year or two earlier, you can imagine what would have happened. Really, really interesting artwork, but also persona, social persona, and this kind of idea of a gender construct. Interesting about Picasso. Picasso exhibited in the first Surrealist exhibition. Andre Breton, who formed Surrealism, claimed that Picasso was one of ours, but he never really fit in because he was already doing his own thing. He was a famous artist. He never really truly was a Dada artist like most of these other artists were. He dabbled in Surrealism, but kept doing Cubism, kept doing his own thing as well. Remember, he got into realism again at the same time. He did the portrait of his wife, Olga, that we saw in the last, a couple chapters ago. Let's see, right here, the dancer, Olga. This was his wife. This was at the beginning of their relationship when they were in love. She described her as she looked, very beautiful. Later in their relationship, as the relationship is dissolving, this is how he pictures her on the beach, not as a bathing beauty, but literally as a crab that could tear things apart. And these were highly sexualized bone figures that he did, multiple paintings in this vein. And it's a really startling painting, a really shocking painting where things are asymmetrical, limbs are distorted, torn apart, not connected, and the mandibles, the mouth becomes like another set of claws or something that could create an unpleasant situation for us, the viewer, or Picasso. He even described his wife as being demasculating of him. He was worried about her cutting off his manhood. They later got divorced, and he had other wives, but this is after, and also other mistresses. This is interesting to see as bookends how he portrays Olga at the beginning of their relationship and how he portrays Olga, and this is no secret, at the end of their resolution of their relationship that is no longer romantic. Man Ray, we talked about before. This is him doing more photography. Man Ray was an American Dada artist, and then later moves to France and becomes part of the surrealist art movement. He did sculpture, he also did painting, and he also did photography. This is a piece, he did one of those rayograms, remember, placing things on top of the photograph, but he also invented this technique, which is really interesting. It's called solarization. What happens is, as you're developing an image, and this one is called fingers of hands, as you're developing that image, if you can at some point flip on the lights, which would normally ruin an image, but then quickly stop it, it's going to reverse some, but not all of the expected tones in a photograph, and it creates this hyper-realistic, surrealist image that looks kind of otherworldly, black and white, switching the tones. Things that should be white are now black, vice versa, but not everything consistently. It still has some shadows and shading that makes sense realistically. So this technique of solarization that Man Ray invented really went well with the themes of surrealism. How does sculpture manifest it? The last two artists that we're going to talk about are sculptors. The first is Alberto Giacometti. He's an Italian artist. After World War II, his work shifts in some of the most beautiful mid-century abstraction that you'll see. But Giacometti, as a surrealist, exhibited works that were inspired by a response to the war. And they're elongated, they're stretched out. It's this really interesting, slender, sleek form that looks somewhat also unusual and foreboding, kind of alien to us. But it is connected to oceanic and ancient Egyptian art. It has this really accentuated, elongated figure, which becomes more predominant in his work later that we will see. It's called invisible object, hands holding the void. That kind of space between the hands becomes important here. The last artist that we're going to talk about is a British artist, Henry Moore. He wasn't really, he had a kind of a loose association with the surrealists. He was working independently in England. He's a British artist, but he started to be exposed to the works of Rodin, Brancusi, Picasso, Giacometti, and he started to exhibit with the surrealist artists. He studied at the Royal College of Art in London, and then after that, in 1925, he became really interested in pre-Columbian and Mexican art. So Mayan art, Aztec art, pre-Columbian, and we can see that in this work here, which is based on a shock mule, which was these Mayan or sculptures by the Mayan people from the 9th century. And it's a distinct type of stone sculpture that would have been this kind of reclining figure that originally would have had a bowl here that libations could be dedicated, offered, sometimes blood, sometimes libations, dedicated to the gods. Well, Henry Moore saw the beauty and the abstraction in these forms and liked their stylized. And so he created these abstract pieces that were surrealistic, that have voids and mass in them that are loosely figurative, right? And you can see, I think in this piece as well, how it's very much inspired and influenced by shock mules, but a really creative, three-dimensional interpretation of surrealism. Beautiful work. These are life size. They're either life size or slightly larger than life size. So if you stood next to this, it is as long as you are, actually a little bit longer, almost 7 foot tall. And they're reclining, which is kind of a, we've seen that as a very traditional motif. If you think about Manet's Olympia, the reclining nude figure, male and female in some cases become almost anonymous or androgynous in their works. Very, very abstract, sensual, sleek, graceful, and these beautiful curvilinear forms, not too dissimilar from where we started at the beginning of the chapter, thinking about Hans Arp's work, but those were meant entirely to be like, what do you see, what do you read into these, where Henry Moore is seeing these more as figures. They also, to me, kind of look like natural formations in stones. Like you could be going through Utah and you could see stone formations like this too that have that sort of ambiguity to them. He made this out of wood and he had to carve it, but you can also imagine nature doing this for us as well. So kind of a combination between here and there, or real and unreal. Peace out. See y'all.